Hi, everyone. Spencer Pauly here, the Western Washington reporter for the Center Square and host of this episode of Washington in Focus. And I'm here today with my colleague, Eastern Washington reporter, Tim Klauser. Now, Tim, we're talking about a story you recently wrote, and this is an article on a Seattle nonprofit busing advocates to Spokane to campaign for local progressive candidates later this week. I think we should start off by, if you can just give us a quick overview of this Washington Bus nonprofit. Who are they? What are they advocating for? Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's this nonprofit out of Seattle called the Washington Bus. So it's on its website, they go by WABUS or wabus.org, but it's essentially this nonprofit that is seeking to drive progressive change in Seattle and other parts of the state. Now, Seattle's on the other half of the state that I don't cover, but the relevance here is that this nonprofit is going after volunteers and trying to get them to participate in an upcoming trip this coming weekend over to Spokane. So they're busing progressive advocates to Spokane to knock doors and canvass for 3 or 4 progressive candidates in the Spokane region. They do this in other parts of the state, but notable that you have an area like Spokane. Yeah, the city is a little bit more blue than, say, the rest of the surrounding region, but not nearly as progressive as, say, Seattle and other areas on the west side. So very interesting to see a nonprofit busing a group of advocates to come campaign for these candidates.
Now, these advocates, they're part of this 10-week paid fellowship program. Is that correct?
No. So
okay.
There's two kind of fronts to this nonprofit. So with a lot of nonprofits, they operate under 2 umbrellas. Now, which would be this nonprofit is a 501c4. C3s aren't allowed to endorse political candidates or really engage in conduct like this. They're supposed to be for more of the broader, greater good of the public. So 501c4s are other types of nonprofits that are allowed to participate in political campaigns, endorse candidates, canvass for them in those communities. So essentially, a lot of nonprofits like WABUS, they set up 2 nonprofits with the same name, except in this case, say the 501c3 that isn't allowed to endorse candidates. That's called the WABUS Education Fund. So that one has a 10-week fellowship where they take these young adults and they train them in progressive politics in what they call a political boot camp. Now, that pays $1,850 an hour. That's separate from the 501c4, which is allowed to get. So, a little bit complex. But essentially, these volunteers doing this trip are unpaid, but they're having all their expenses covered on this trip. Their food, transportation, lodging, they don't have to pay for it. As long as they're willing to go, WABUS will cover it all.
Yeah, so that was one thing I note from the story is that this organization is covering transportation, lodging, and food for these volunteers. Now, this trip's happening from October 17th through the 19th, and it's going to Spokane. Can you tell me why exactly they're going to Spokane?
Well, I reached out to WABUS, the organization, with a list of questions. I have a few of them here, kind of just asking, how many people they kind of plan on taking, what the goal is with the trip, how they're funding it, whether they're going to report it to the PDC, which they are required to do, whether it involves taxpayer funds, stuff like this. I sent them a list of questions, and days later they responded. And in their response, they just said, the WABUS is the statewide 501c4 youth civic engagement organization with staff across the state. Founded in 2007, we're proud to create opportunities to show young people that they have impact in their own neighborhoods and communities. They didn't answer or address any of my questions that were very direct in my email to their media team. But what Zappone told me is that he thinks that they do trips like this to create a presence in Spokane and other parts of the state. He noted that it is a statewide organization, even though it's based in Seattle. A lot of its messaging is geared around Seattle on its website, but he thinks they want to come here and get more people involved locally so then they can expand their network, despite the fact that they're busing people into Spokane to do this trip.
So Washington Bus is endorsing Councilmember Zach Zappone in his race against Chris Savage. Now, you also reached out to Chris Savage about this. What did he have to say about this Washington Bus coming through to Spokane?
He essentially said that the fact that this trip is happening is just evidence that his campaign is successful and that it's scaring his opponent. He said that his opponent is relying on busing in outside support. And I talked to his opponent about this, and he kind of pushed back saying, look, they endorsed me, but I wasn't really aware of this trip, that it was happening outside of what I had seen on social media, wherever he first saw it. But they're not engaging with him and planning going out with him directly to do these initiatives. It's kind of something that they're doing on their own, but they did endorse him. One other thing that Councilmember Zappone brought up in his conversation with me is that Councilmember Paul Dillon, another member that sits in the progressive majority in Spokane, he is actually on the board of directors for this nonprofit. And he discloses this on his kind of city council profile on the city's website. But when you go to the WABUS board of directors and staff page, it specifically says that they do not publicly state or show information about their board or who they are. And that if you want any information about WABUS, that you have to reach out to them. Now, I did that, and I think we already talked about how they didn't respond to any of my questions.
Right. And I think another thing I see here on your story I'm looking at right now is, I think Zappone here mentions that, Spokane Good Government Alliance donated $6,800 to Savage's campaign, whereas Washington Bus only contributed around $1,000. Now, is that just comparing? What is the issue with that exactly? I feel like there's something here we're missing.
Yeah. The thing that he was trying to get at, and I was saying, look, people are concerned in the community about outside influence in Spokane. You have a very progressive area like Seattle campaigning in Spokane for these candidates, essentially pushing an outside agenda. And he was saying, look, if we're going to talk about outside influence here, we have to address the money that this PAC is committing to my opponent. He said, look, he also gets support from donors that live outside of the city of Spokane, like Chud Wendell. Now, Chud Wendell runs the Hutton Settlement, which is this property management company that also shelters and provides care to youth that have troubled home lives, are homeless, etc. So he's been living and operating out of the Spokane region for decades. His family runs a big car dealership in the area, and they have for decades. He also has other business ventures in the region. It wasn't until, I believe, the last few years that he moved his home to Coeur d'Alene. Now, that's 30 something minutes away from Spokane, just down I-90. So, to say that he is an outside donor is really a stretch. So what he was trying to say is, look, if we're going to talk about outside influence, you have to talk about this. Now, the difference in money, there's also something to explain there. Now, Zappone was telling me that, nonprofits like this kind of work is called an in-kind contribution. They're not giving Zappone money. They're donating this value of services. So essentially, after this trip, the nonprofit is going to take all their receipts and they have to report those to the Washington State campaign website, where they track all these campaign finances. And so they're limited in how much they can contribute with these in-kind contributions on the general election and the primary election. So the nonprofit donated about $1,000 or so in services to Zappone leading up to the primary election. Now they're limited to about that same amount for the general election. So we won't know how much they spend on this trip until they report it. So it could be somewhere around the same amount, and that's what they'll be limited to with contributing. But it's different with like direct monetary contributions, whether it's coming from a person or a group, or there's things called indirect expenditures. So money that wasn't given to Zappone, but was spent to kind of advocate for him. Not Zappone, sorry, but Savage in this case. The Good Government, or the Good Spokane Government Alliance, this conservative political action committee out of Spokane, they've done things like pay for billboards, run television ads and stuff like that for Zappone and other candidates in the past. Not Zappone, sorry, Savage and other candidates in the past. So the 6,800 that's noted on the website, that's what the PAC reported to the state as saying, this is what we plan to spend. That's not everything they have spent. They've maybe spent around 6,000 of that, I believe, so far from what Savage told me in our conversation. Yeah. So they could spend up to that $6,800 limit. But that kind of just shows the discrepancies between the two. But Savage's point when I was talking to him was like, look, this PAC is based out of Spokane. It's funded by people that live in the Spokane area. And WABUS is not that. It has Dylan on the board, but it's this progressive nonprofit based out of Seattle that is bussing in opposition to campaign against more conservative candidates that are already on the council and running to the council to kind of expand the majority.
I think that's all good context for our viewers here, Tim, in regards to that. But I have one more question for you, and that's just with elections just weeks away. With Spokane, we're having this huge push from progressive candidates. Where do we stand currently on some of these races? And I'm just curious about what kind of measurable impact Washington Bus will have in the Spokane push.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, this is still just one nonprofit that's coming out here. They're going to knock doors. Maybe it'll inspire some voters who kind of didn't know what was going on to go to the ballot and to vote for one of these candidates, but it's hard to really measure the exact impact. I mean, you can look at the races. You have Councilmember Zappone, who kind of leads the progressive majority a lot of times. But it is unpopular among like more conservative voters, business owners, due to his positions on issues like homelessness and public safety. And then he's the incumbent. He's been there for years. So reelecting him would be maintaining the status quo. And then you have Christopher Savage, who's run for council, I believe, 3 times in the past, all unsuccessfully, but kind of takes a more harsher stance towards public safety and upholding the will of the voters. So he's more popular in regards with business owners in that degree. Zappone did win the primary election, but now you have Savage leading the race in terms of campaign finances. So he has a little bit more to play with in terms of running his campaign. Then you have another race, Kate Tellis. She's another one of the more pro-youth progressive candidates that the nonprofit is endorsing and campaigning for next weekend. She's running against Alejandro Bartinos. I might have butchered his name there, but he's a local business executive who also would kind of align with more of the conservative minority on the council. And then you have a few other races in there, school board race. But it'll be interesting to see how things play out. It's hard to say exactly what impact it'll have. But I think the fact that they are having people come from Seattle and other parts of the state to advocate for these candidates really tells a story of its own.
Well, as we continue marching towards that November 4th date, I know you'll continue your stellar reporting of these local races in Spokane. So thanks, Tim. And viewers can check out his stories at thecentersquare.com. This is Spencer Pauly. Thanks. See you next week.